This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 3, Decipherment. In this lesson, we'll talk about the decipherment process of Old Persian. So Old Persian was a language that was spoken in modern-day Iran, and it was written using the cuneiform script, which is a script which we talked about, used very widely in the Middle East and Mesopotamia. In the 1700s, the knowledge of this language was not known. In fact, a lot of people weren't even sure that these cuneiform inscriptions were actually inscriptions at all. They thought they might be some kind of decoration or even just bird footprints. But in fact, it is a writing system. And here's how the writing system was actually deciphered. A German archaeologist named George Grotefend was the first to attempt to decipher this kind of writing system. And to do this, he made a few educated guesses to get him started. So in the textbook, we have these two inscriptions here, which were found accompanying a depiction of two kings in the ancient city of Persepolis. So Grotefend made the assumption that the kings were Darius and Xerxes. So these are two very famous Persian kings from history and from biblical records. He made an assumption that the kings depicted were these two individuals. And if that's the case, then their names are probably depicted somewhere in this text. He also noticed that when he looked at these cuneiform symbols, that there are a very small number of them, and each symbol tends to occur pretty frequently in the text, in the same way that as an alphabet. For example, our English alphabet has 26 letters, and each letter occurs very frequently. Compare this to something like Chinese, where there are thousands of characters, and each individual character does not occur as frequently. So based on that kind of frequency, Grotefend could conclude that cuneiform is more of an alphabet rather than something like a syllabary or a logography. So that was another initial assumption he made. He also noticed that, and you can see in this text as well, is that a lot of these symbols are separated by diagonal slashes. And what he assumed is that those diagonal slashes are used for word separators, which gives further indication that this writing system is more phonetic and is more alphabetic. And when we're actually doing a decipherment of a language, it's really important to know what language it's actually representing. So to do this, what Grotefend assumed was that the Old Persian language is probably similar to one of its potential descendants, which is the Avestan language, which is still spoken today and is the liturgical language of Zoroastrianism. So he used this to get a good idea of what kind of sounds these symbols might represent and what kind of common words there might be. Also, Grotefend made an assumption about what the inscription would probably say if it's near a depiction of a set of kings. So he assumed it probably said something like Darius, great king, king of kings, son of Xerxes. So that gave him an indication as to what the whole text may say. So based on these kind of assumptions, Grotefend could make some educated guesses as to what this text means. And what Grotefend noticed, and as was highlighted in the previous picture, is that there are some sets of symbols which tend to repeat at multiple times in the text. And he made the assumption that these repeating sets of symbols are the names of Darius and Xerxes. So with that assumption, we can pair each symbol to each sound in the name Darius and Xerxes. Now, the way that Darius and Xerxes, those names are pronounced, varies depending on what language we're using. In Old Persian, you wouldn't call the king Darius, you would probably say something like Darheush. So that's why the assumption of the language is very important. That would determine how these sounds would actually represent. And once we make that guess, we can see that there are actually, for example, that the last sound of Darius is a sh sound, and we can see that same symbol occurs in the other set of symbols which occurs frequently in the same pattern that we would find for the name Xerxes or Xerxes, for example. And with this initial analysis, we can see that that the decipherment is starting to fall into place. And so once you start with these names, we have a better idea of how each of these symbols represents a sound. And they could be used to begin to decipher the other words in the text as well. So names are a very good starting point for this kind of thing. So Grotefend's hypothesis wasn't really fully correct, though. Not all of his hypotheses that he made were. But there were a lot of underlying assumptions which were mostly accurate, and that led to the successful decipherment of Old Persian. For one thing, he was correct that the Old Persian language is related to the Avestan language. And he is correct that the two kings depicted were Darius and Xerxes. And he was also correct that these symbols that he was examining represent sound information rather than word information, as in the cuneiform is not a logography. And he was able to make this conclusion because there were a small number of symbols which occurred frequently, which is the sign that you're dealing with an alphabetic or a more phonetic kind of script. So now Grotefend assumed that these were letters, but in fact we actually know now that they are syllables and that Old Persian was a syllabary. And this kind of finding happened later once the analysis of cuneiform was more complete and once more evidence was brought from other archaeological findings. But what's really important about the decipherment of Old Persian is that it began the process of decipherment of all the other languages which are written in cuneiform. And these languages are very different from each other typologically. So the decipherment of Old Persian was really the key that allowed these other languages to be deciphered. So they all represent sounds in the same way, and that's why this enabled this decipherment. And this is a pattern we'll see a lot in decipherment, is that a lot of times writing systems will have evolved from another earlier writing system, and we can use that information to begin a decipherment. So this was the case for Old Persian, and that's why we were able to decipher cuneiform in this way.